The world did not begin with a word, but with a roar, a continuous, world-ending thunder that turned the very soil to dust and the sky to fire. For the people of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, this was the only reality. It was a sound that was not merely heard but felt, a physical presence that vibrated through the limestone caves, shook the marrow in their bones, and erased the memory of silence. The island itself, a place of ancient traditions and gentle hills, seemed to scream under the assault. This was not war as it had been known. This was an industrial apocalypse, a symphony of destruction played by an invisible, untouchable orchestra. They called it the Typhoon of Steel. From the deck of a command ship, the view was one of sublime and terrible power. The sea, for miles in every direction, was not water but a solid mass of grey steel. Over 1,500 ships formed a floating city of war, a forest of masts and gun barrels that blotted out the horizon. Carriers, their decks alive with the frantic ballet of takeoffs and landings, launched swarms of aircraft that blackened the sky. Battleships, titans of a passing age, unleashed broadsides that sounded like the cracking of continents. Their 16-inch shells, each the weight of a small automobile, arced through the air with a freight train shriek before landing on the small island, creating artificial volcanoes of earth and fire that climbed thousands of feet into the air. Cruisers and destroyers added their voices to the chorus, their 5-inch and 8-inch guns firing in a relentless, percussive rhythm that never ceased, day or night. This was Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, a concentration of military might that dwarfed the Normandy landings in sheer naval and aerial power. It was the culmination of 3 years of brutal, island-by-island warfare, the final expression of America's industrial capacity unleashed upon its most determined foe. The men watching from those ships, the Marines and soldiers of the 10th Army, were veterans of places that had become synonyms for hell: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. They were hardened, weary, and under no illusions about what awaited them. Yet even they were awestruck by the sheer scale of the force they had become a part of. It felt less like an invasion and more like a geological event, an act of planetary reshaping. Deep within a cave carved into the island's southern half, a young Okinawan girl named Tomiko Higa huddled with her family. The world above was an abstraction, a constant, violent tremor that sent dust and pebbles raining down from the ceiling of their refuge. Each explosion was a physical blow, a concussive wave that stole the air from their lungs. The roar was so complete that it was impossible to speak. They communicated through wide, terrified eyes and trembling hands. For weeks, this had been their existence. The sun was a memory. The outside world was nothing but a sound, a feeling of being inside a drum beaten by a giant. She held a small wooden doll, a relic from a forgotten time of peace, and pressed it against her chest, as if its simple form could ward off the industrial demon that was devouring her home. She could not comprehend the strategy, the politics, or the hatreds that had brought this storm to her shores. She only knew the shaking of the earth, the suffocating dust, and the profound, animal certainty that her world was being unmade. On April 1st, 1945 Easter Sunday, a day the American planners, with a strange and dark sense of irony, had codenamed Love Day, the bombardment finally focused its fury on the landing beaches of Hagushi. After a final, deafening crescendo, a sudden, eerie silence fell. For the first time in weeks, the island held its breath. Then came the next wave. 60,000 American soldiers and Marines of the 10th Army, packed into landing craft, churned toward the shore. They braced themselves for the slaughter they had come to expect, for the machine gun fire that had turned the waters red at Tarawa, for the mortar shells that had rained down on Iwo Jima. The ramps dropped. Men charged into the surf, screaming, their rifles held high. They stormed the beaches, expecting to be cut down at any moment. But nothing happened. There were no machine guns, no mortars, no artillery, only a strange, unsettling quiet. The Americans pushed inland, past the shattered palm trees and cratered fields, their nerves stretched taut. Division after division came ashore, a flood of men and machines, and met only silence. It was baffling, unnerving. Where was the enemy? Had the weeks of relentless shelling actually worked? Had they finally managed to obliterate a Japanese garrison before the first man set foot on land? The American commanders were cautious, suspicious. This was too easy. It felt like a trap. They pushed further, securing the island's two main airfields, Kadena and Yontan, within hours and with almost no casualties. The speed was astonishing. It seemed the battle for Okinawa might be over before it had truly begun. But the silence was deceptive. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of patience. The island was not empty. It was waiting. The defenders were not gone. They had simply withdrawn, conceding the beaches and the north of the island according to a cold and deliberate plan. They had burrowed deep into the earth, into the honeycombed limestone ridges and fortified caves of the south. They had transformed the island's southern third into a fortress, a multi-layered killing ground unlike anything the Americans had ever faced. The typhoon of steel had flattened the surface, but it had not touched the heart of the defense. The real battle for Okinawa had not yet started, and the eerie quiet that so unsettled the invaders was merely the deep, calm breath a predator takes before it strikes. Inside a high-level American command room, far from the shaking earth of Okinawa, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and the quiet confidence of overwhelming power. A massive map of the Pacific Ocean dominated one wall, a canvas charting 3 years of blood and sacrifice. Red arrows and pins marked the inexorable American advance across the vast expanse: Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas. Each pin represented thousands of lives, a brutal education in the nature of their enemy. An admiral, his face a mask of grim determination, stood before the map. His finger, thick and steady, traced the final leg of this journey. He tapped the black volcanic speck of Iwo Jima, where the fighting had been unspeakably savage only weeks before. Then, his finger moved north, landing decisively on a larger, apostrophe-shaped island, just 340 miles south of the Japanese mainland. Okinawa. This is it, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality. The last stop. Okinawa was not just another island to be taken, it was the keystone of the entire Pacific strategy. It was the linchpin upon which the end of the war would turn. For the American war planners, its capture was an absolute, non-negotiable necessity. The island possessed large, flat areas perfect for airfields, deep water anchorages for the fleet, and enough space to stockpile the millions of tons of supplies and quarter the 1 million men required for the final, apocalyptic invasion of Japan itself. Operation Downfall. From Okinawa, American B-29 superfortresses could strike Japan's industrial heart with impunity, escorted by fighters for the entire round trip. From its harbors, the greatest invasion fleet in human history would assemble to deliver the death blow to the Japanese Empire on its own sacred soil. The island was a dagger pointed directly at the heart of Japan, and taking it was the last major step before the final battle. The man tasked with wielding this dagger on the ground was Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. He was a conventional, by-the-book commander, the son of a Confederate general. He was 60 years old, solid, and dependable, a man who believed in the simple, brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. Concentrate overwhelming firepower on a single point until the enemy breaks. He had commanded the Alaska Defense Command, a backwater of the war, and Okinawa was his chance to prove himself on the world's biggest stage. He was confident, perhaps overconfident. Having witnessed the typhoon of steel, he believed, like many of his staff, that no defense could withstand such a pounding. He expected a tough fight, yes, but a relatively quick one. He anticipated a direct, frontal assault against a dazed and shattered enemy. He fundamentally underestimated the sophistication of the Japanese defenses and the cold, calculating strategy that governed them. He was preparing to fight the last war, a war of attrition and firepower, while his opponent was preparing to fight a very different kind of war altogether. For the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the equation was starkly different. There was no illusion of victory on Okinawa. The war was lost, and they knew it. The industrial might of the United States was a reality that could no longer be ignored. The question was not how to win, but how to end the war on terms other than unconditional surrender, a concept that was anathema to the Japanese military code of honor and their devotion to the emperor. Okinawa was their final, desperate gambit. The island, its garrison, and its civilian population were to be a sacrificial shield for the homeland. The strategy, codenamed Tengo, or Heavenly Operation, was one of calculated, horrific attrition. The goal was simple: to kill as many Americans as possible. The 32nd Army on Okinawa was ordered not to win, not to repel the invasion, but to fight to the last man and inflict such a staggering butcher's bill that the American public, already weary of war, would lose its stomach for the planned invasion of Japan. They hoped to create a bloodbath so profound, so shocking, that Washington would be forced to the negotiating table, allowing Japan to retain its emperor and its martial traditions. The 110,000 soldiers on Okinawa were not a garrison. They were a down payment in blood, a sacrifice intended to buy a less dishonorable peace. They were ordered to make the price of victory so high that the victor would recoil in horror from his prize. The island was a poison pill, designed to be swallowed by the Americans at the greatest possible cost. The defenders were not fighting for their lives. They were fighting to orchestrate their deaths and the deaths of their enemies on the grandest and most terrible scale imaginable. This was not a battle for territory. It was a battle to manipulate the psychology of an entire nation through sheer, unmitigated slaughter. If you appreciate this deep dive into the strategic calculations that set the stage for one of history's most brutal battles, please consider subscribing to the channel. Hitting that bell icon ensures you won't miss our future explorations of history's most pivotal moments, and let us know in the comments what other battles you'd like to see us cover. Sharing this video with a friend who loves history is the best way to help our community grow. Deep beneath the ancient limestone foundations of Shuri Castle, the centuries-old seat of Okinawan kings, the air was thick, humid, and smelled of damp earth and stale cigarette smoke. Here, in a labyrinth of tunnels and command bunkers, the two architects of Okinawa's defense stood over a map illuminated by a single sputtering lantern. The flickering light cast their shadows long and dancing on the rough-hewn walls, making them look less like men and more like figures from a myth. A patient demon and a raging god deciding the fate of the 250,000 souls on the island above. The first man, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, was the embodiment of calm aristocratic professionalism. He was 57 years old, with a neatly trimmed mustache and eyes that held a deep, unshakable serenity. A former commandant of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, he was a strategist, a thinker, a man who understood the cold, brutal geometry of a war of position. He was respected, even loved by his men for his quiet dignity and his refusal to waste their lives needlessly. He was the patient demon, the pragmatic general who knew victory was impossible. His entire strategy was built on this grim acceptance of reality. He would not contest the American landings. He would cede the northern two-thirds of the island without a fight. He would let the American behemoth come to him, drawing it into a battleground of his own choosing, the dense, hilly, fortress-like terrain of southern Okinawa. Here, he had overseen the construction of the Shuri Line, a defensive masterpiece. It was not a single line, but a defense in depth, miles deep, a complex web of interlocking caves, hidden machine gun nests, fortified ridges, concealed mortar pits, and underground tunnels that connected them all. His plan was pure attrition. He would make the Americans pay for every single foot of ground with a river of their own blood. He would bleed them white, grinding their divisions down in a slow, agonizing war of inches, not miles. He represented the cold, calculating, professional heart of the Japanese defense. Pacing beside him, his fists clenched and his face a mask of furious energy, was his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho. Cho was everything Ushijima was not. He was fiery, aggressive, and utterly consumed by the fanatical ideology of the Imperial Army. A notorious hardliner who had been involved in several political assassinations and plots in the 1930s, Cho was a zealot, a true believer in the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior. He viewed Ushijima's defensive strategy with open contempt. To him, It was cowardly, a passive acceptance of defeat. He believed that the true strength of the Japanese soldier lay not in concrete pillboxes or clever positioning, but in his spirit, his willingness to die for the emperor in a glorious, decisive charge. He was the raging god, constantly agitating for massive, all-out counterattacks, for suicidal banzai charges that would shatter the enemy through sheer ferocity and spiritual power. He believed that a single, glorious blow could break the American will to fight. He represented the fanatical, faith-driven, and ultimately self-destructive soul of the Japanese military. This was the central human drama of the Battle of Okinawa, a fundamental conflict of military philosophy playing out in the humid darkness of the command bunker. It was an alliance as unlikely and as volatile as that of the pragmatic Hunyadi and the zealous Capistrano at Belgrade. Ushijima, the professional, sought to orchestrate a slow, methodical, and bloody defense designed to maximize enemy casualties over time. Cho, the fanatic, sought a single, transcendent moment of glorious combat, a final, beautiful explosion of Japanese spirit that would redeem their inevitable defeat. Ushijima's strategy was based on firepower and terrain. Cho's was based on faith and fury. For weeks, as the Americans consolidated their positions in the north, this debate raged in the Shuri headquarters. Cho and other aggressive officers, like the brilliant but hot-headed Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, argued relentlessly for a massive counterattack against the vulnerable American beachhead. They saw the American forces spread out, their supply lines still being organized, and believed it was the perfect moment to strike, to drive the invaders back into the sea in a single decisive battle. Ushijima, patient and resolute, held his ground. He knew that to send his men out of their fortifications and into the open would be to sacrifice them on the altar of American firepower. Out there, beyond the protection of the caves and ridges, they would be annihilated by the typhoon of steel, the naval guns, the massed artillery, and the absolute air supremacy of the Americans. He argued, calmly and logically, that their only hope of fulfilling their mission to delay and bleed the enemy was to remain in their defensive shell. Every day the Americans spent battering themselves against the Shuri line was another day bought for the defense of the homeland. For now, Ushijima's logic prevailed. He was the commander. The patient demon would have his way. The trap would be set, and he would wait for the enemy to walk into it. But the raging god was not silenced. He was merely waiting for his moment, his conviction that spirit could triumph over steel burning as brightly as ever. A young Okinawan girl, no older than 16, stood in a line with her classmates. Her school uniform, a simple dark skirt and white blouse, was now spattered with the mud of a hastily dug trench. A stern-faced Japanese soldier, his own uniform clean and his expression devoid of emotion, moved down the line. When he reached her, he pushed a sharpened bamboo spear into her hands. "Your country needs you," he said, his voice flat. She looked at the primitive weapon, its tip hardened by fire. Then she looked toward the northern horizon, where the constant rumble of explosions was a reminder of the approaching storm. She had been taught to arrange flowers, to practice calligraphy, to serve tea. Now she was being told to face the world's most powerful army with a pointed stick. This was the tragic reality of the force defending Okinawa. It was not simply the veteran soldiers of the Imperial Japanese 32nd Army. It was an army of ghosts and children, a desperate amalgamation of professional warriors and terrified civilians. Alongside the 36,000 battle-hardened troops of the 24th Division and the 62nd Division were tens of thousands of conscripted Okinawan men, the Boitai. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, and school teachers, many of them middle-aged or elderly, torn from their homes and pressed into service. Armed with little more than bamboo spears, ancient rifles, or even just farm implements, they were used primarily for digging tunnels and hauling supplies. But as the battle intensified, they would be thrown into the front lines as human shields, ordered to charge American positions in suicidal attacks to draw fire and reveal machine gun nests. They were expendable, a buffer of flesh to be used and discarded by the mainland Japanese army. The most poignant and heartbreaking component of this civilian force was the students. Thousands of Okinawan boys, some as young as 14, were organized into Iron and Blood Imperial Corps, serving as runners, ammunition bearers, and eventually combatants in suicide squads. Their female classmates were also mobilized. The most famous of these units were the Lily Corps, composed of 222 students and 18 teachers from two of Okinawa's elite girls' high schools. They were not handed spears but medical satchels. They were to become nurses. These girls, aged 15 to 19, were assigned to the Heibaru Army Hospital, a nightmarish series of caves dug into the hills south of Shuri. In the perpetual darkness, lit only by flickering carbide lamps, they worked in conditions of unimaginable horror. The air was a foul mixture of blood, gangrene, and unwashed bodies. They tended to men with shattered limbs, gaping wounds, and torsos torn open by shrapnel. With minimal supplies, often having to wash and reuse bloody bandages, they did their best to provide comfort and care in a place utterly devoid of it. They carried bedpans, fed the wounded, and assisted surgeons in crude amputations performed without anesthetic, their schoolgirl uniforms becoming permanently stained with the blood of dying men. They were the ultimate symbol of the courage of ordinary people caught in the gears of war, but their service was born of coercion, and their bravery was exploited in a hopeless cause. This forced alliance was poisoned by a deep-seated prejudice. The mainland Japanese soldiers of the 32nd Army viewed the Okinawans not as fellow countrymen, but as second-class subjects, their loyalty suspect. The Okinawan dialect was different, their customs distinct. The Japanese soldiers treated them with contempt and brutality, commandeering their food, destroying their homes for fortifications, and showing no hesitation in sacrificing them. This cruel dynamic was amplified by a relentless propaganda campaign. The Japanese military police spread terrifying stories about the American devils. They told the Okinawans that the American soldiers were monsters who would rape the women and torture the men, that they would show no mercy, and that a quick, honorable death was infinitely preferable to capture. They warned that anyone who even attempted to surrender would be executed as a traitor. This created an atmosphere of pure terror, trapping the Okinawan civilians between two unstoppable forces: the overwhelming firepower of the Americans and the fanatical coercion of their supposed Japanese protectors. For the Okinawans, there was no blessing in this alliance, only a nightmare. Unlike the peasant crusaders at Belgrade, who were driven by a shared faith and a common goal with the professional soldiers, the Okinawan people were caught in a vice. They were not willing participants in a holy war. They were hostages in their own homes, their lives and their islands sacrificed for a cause they did not share, by an army that despised them. The courage they displayed was not the courage of zealots, but the quiet, desperate courage of survival in a world that had descended into madness. An American Marine lay flat on his stomach, the taste of mud and blood filling his mouth. He pressed his face into the red earth, trying to make himself smaller as machine gun bullets snapped inches above his head. He looked up at the ridge in front of him, a nondescript, muddy hill, stripped of all vegetation, pockmarked with shell craters. It was no more than 300 feet high. He could not see a single enemy soldier, but he could hear them. He could hear the distinct, rhythmic woodpecker sound of the Nambu machine guns, the terrifying, airy whistle of incoming mortar rounds, what the Marines called knee mortars, and he could feel the ground shake with explosions. That insignificant-looking hill had a name, Sugarloaf, and for the men of the 6th Marine Division, it was the purest definition of hell on earth. This was the Shuri Line in action. After weeks of methodical advance, the American 10th Army had finally run headlong into Ushijima's masterpiece of defensive warfare. The fighting that began in mid-April was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was a slow, agonizing, intimate form of slaughter. The battle was not for miles, but for feet. It was a meat grinder, a systematic process of trading American lives for yards of fortified ground. Ushijima's strategy was working perfectly. The Americans, accustomed to battles of maneuver, were forced into brutal, frontal assaults against an almost invisible enemy. The landscape was a labyrinth of death. Hills like Sugarloaf, Chocolate Drop, and Conical Hill, along with ridges like Kakazu Ridge, were the anchors of the line. Each was a fortress unto itself. honeycombed with tunnels and caves that were impervious to artillery and bombs. A position that was pounded into dust by a naval bombardment would suddenly spring to life as Japanese soldiers emerged from deep underground to man their machine guns and mortars. The defensive positions were interlocking. A machine gun nest on one hill provided covering fire for a mortar pit on another. To attack one position meant exposing your flank to two others. American soldiers would capture the crest of a ridge, only to be hit by a ferocious counterattack from Japanese soldiers emerging from reverse slope positions that were hidden from view and protected from artillery. It was a three-dimensional battlefield, and the Japanese owned the underground. The casualties were staggering. Entire companies were wiped out in a matter of hours. The process was brutally simple. Bombard a position, assault it with infantry and tanks, take horrific losses, capture it, and then fight off savage counterattacks, before moving a few hundred yards to do it all over again. For 3 weeks, this bloody stalemate continued. Ushijima's patient attritional strategy was bleeding the 10th Army white. The Americans were gaining ground, but at a cost that was becoming politically and militarily unsustainable. The fighting was taking a severe psychological toll. Cases of combat fatigue skyrocketed. The relentless claustrophobic nature of the combat, the constant proximity to death, and the sheer stubbornness of the defense were pushing men to their breaking point. And inside the command bunker at Shuri, the pressure was also building. The fanatical General Cho watched the slow, grinding retreat with growing impatience and fury. He saw the mounting Japanese casualties and viewed Ushijima's strategy not as a success, but as a slow, dishonorable death. He and his faction argued more forcefully than ever that the time had come to strike back. They had absorbed the Americans' best punches. Now was the moment to unleash the spirit of the Japanese army in a decisive blow. They had intelligence, faulty as it turned out, that the American forces were overextended and their morale was cracking. Cho saw a fleeting opportunity for a glorious victory. Finally, after weeks of resisting the pressure, Ushijima's resolve began to fray. He was a professional, but he was also a product of the same military culture as Cho. The pressure from his staff, combined with the agonizingly slow retreat, wore him down. Against his own better judgment, against the strenuous objections of his brilliant operations officer, Colonel Yahara, Ushijima gave in. He authorized a massive, all-out counter-offensive, scheduled for May 4th. It was to be the decisive battle Cho had always dreamed of. The attack was a catastrophe. On the night of May 4th, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers streamed out of their fortified positions. For the first time in the battle, they abandoned the protection of their caves and ridges and charged into the open. They ran directly into the jaws of the typhoon of steel. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Naval gunfire from the battleships and cruisers offshore created a curtain of high explosives. Massed batteries of American artillery, over 900 guns, fired without pause, turning the valleys and fields into a churning hell of shrapnel and fire. American planes, which owned the sky, dropped bombs and napalm, strafing the exposed Japanese infantry. It was a complete and utter slaughter. The Japanese soldiers, driven by their belief in spiritual power, charged headlong into the greatest concentration of industrial firepower the world had ever seen. Faith met firepower, and faith was annihilated. Entire regiments were erased. Men were vaporized by direct hits from artillery shells, scythed down in droves by machine guns, and incinerated by napalm. By the end of May 5th, the counterattack had completely failed. The 32nd Army had lost over 5,000 of its best and most experienced soldiers, along with its precious artillery reserves. Its offensive capability was shattered forever. The decisive mistake had been made. Cho's dream of a glorious battle had led to a senseless massacre, and in doing so, had broken the back of the Shuri Line's defense. Ushijima's carefully constructed meat grinder had been compromised from within, not by American tactics, but by Japanese fanaticism. The failure of the May 4th offensive was a turning point. It had a profound psychological effect on both sides. For the Americans, it was proof that their strategy of attrition, however costly, was the correct one. For the Japanese, it was a devastating blow to morale. Having lost their best offensive troops, they now had no choice but to fall back on a purely defensive struggle, but they were significantly weaker for the attempt. The great gamble had failed, and now all that was left was to pay the price. If this chronicle of strategic blunders and their horrific consequences is something you find compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button. It tells us you value this kind of detailed historical analysis and helps others discover our work. A lone Japanese soldier, his uniform little more than a collection of muddy rags, stumbled south. His rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos. Behind him, the sky glowed a hellish orange from the fires consuming the ruins of Shuri Castle. Ahead of him, there was only the sea and the sheer cliffs of the island's southern tip. The organized, disciplined 32nd Army was gone, shattered into 1,000 desperate fragments. Now, it was just a chaotic flight of survivors, a torrent of defeated soldiers and terrified civilians, all being funneled into a final, shrinking pocket of resistance with their backs to the ocean. The collapse of the Shuri line, which finally fell in late May, triggered a mass exodus. The methodical, grinding battle of the north gave way to a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival in the south. The fighting devolved into a series of frantic, vicious skirmishes for control of individual caves, tombs, and ravines. The front line ceased to exist. It was everywhere and nowhere. American troops, using flamethrowers and satchel charges, became exterminators, methodically clearing out the thousands of caves that dotted the southern landscape. The Japanese soldiers, often trapped with Okinawan civilians, fought with suicidal determination. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant, already blurred, completely dissolved. It was in this final, desperate phase of the battle that the full horror of the Japanese propaganda was unleashed. At places like Mabuni Hill, where the last Japanese command post was established, a wave of mass suicide swept through the civilian population. Convinced by the soldiers among them that the approaching Americans would inflict unspeakable tortures before killing them, entire families took their own lives. Mothers, their faces streaked with tears, killed their own children before being killed by their husbands, who then took their own lives. They leaped from the high sea cliffs onto the rocks below, a final, tragic act of defiance born of fear and lies. Japanese soldiers provided grenades to civilians, urging them to commit this honorable suicide rather than face the dishonor of capture. It was the horrific culmination of a strategy that had always treated the Okinawan people as utterly expendable. Amid this chaos, the surviving girls of the Himiyuri Lily Corps faced their final ordeal. On June 18th, with the Japanese lines completely disintegrated, their unit was unceremoniously disbanded. After months of selfless, harrowing service in the hospital caves, they were simply dismissed. A teacher told them, "From this moment on, you are on your own." Thrown out into the middle of a raging battlefield, these teenage girls, who had seen more death and suffering than most veteran soldiers, were left to fend for themselves. Most did not survive. Hunted and terrified, many were killed by American shells and flamethrowers as they hid in caves. Others, succumbing to the propaganda, took their own lives with grenades given to them by soldiers. Of the 240 students and teachers of the Lily Corps, 136 died in the final days of the battle, a tragic testament to the ultimate betrayal of their courage. The climax of the battle, and the end of the 32nd Army, came on June 22nd, on a promontory known as Hill 89. In a cave overlooking the sea, with American forces closing in just a few hundred yards away, General Ushijima and General Cho prepared for their end. The scene was one of grim, ritualistic calm. Dressed in full-dress uniforms, the two generals sat on a white sheet spread over a quilt. Ushijima, the patient demon, was composed and serene, as he had been throughout the battle. He calmly wrote a final farewell poem. Cho, the raging god, was reportedly cheerful, almost joyful, that this final, glorious moment of death had arrived. Following the ancient samurai code of Bushido, they performed seppuku. An aide stood by with a sword. Ushijima opened his tunic, took a ceremonial dagger, and plunged it into his own abdomen, slicing from left to right. As he did, the aide brought the sword down, decapitating him in a single, clean stroke, the final act of mercy. Then General Cho did the same. Their deaths were a quiet, formal affair, a stark contrast to the chaotic slaughter raging just outside their cave. It was a final, symbolic act that encapsulated the two warring ideologies that had governed Okinawa's defense. The pragmatic professional and the fiery fanatic, who had clashed in life over strategy, were united in a ritualized death that honored the code they both served. Their suicide marked the official end of organized resistance on Okinawa. The battle was over. General Buckner, the American commander, would not live to see the victory. He had been killed by an artillery shell just 4 days earlier, becoming the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire in the entire war. The final cost of the battle was beyond staggering. The United States suffered over 49,000 casualties, with more than 12,500 killed or missing, making it the costliest battle of the Pacific War for the Americans. The Japanese lost an estimated 110,000 soldiers, but the greatest tragedy was inflicted upon the people of Okinawa. As many as 140,000 civilians, nearly a third of the island's population, perished killed in the crossfire, dead from disease and starvation, or victims of the forced suicides. The last stand had failed to stop the American advance, but its legacy was profound and world-altering. The sheer horror of the Battle of Okinawa, the fanatical resistance of the soldiers, and the mass civilian deaths provided American leaders with a terrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese mainland would entail. The casualty projections for Operation Downfall, based on the experience of Okinawa, were astronomical, running into the millions for both sides. This grim calculation, this vision of a nation prepared to fight to the last man, woman, and child, played a direct and crucial role in the decision to use a new, terrible weapon. The fire that consumed Okinawa would ultimately lead to the atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a desperate attempt to avoid an even greater bloodbath. The tragic sacrifice of Okinawa had not saved Japan, but its ferocity had irrevocably changed the course of history. What do you think was the most significant factor in the devastating outcome of this battle? Was it the clash of leadership, the overwhelming American firepower, or the tragic role of the civilian population? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. Their final, violent stand on that small island sent a shockwave that would define the very end of the war and the dawn of a new, more terrifying age. But in the end, it was just that, an end, not a victory. Thank you for joining us for this look into the tragic last stand on Okinawa. If you found this story compelling and want to continue exploring the most dramatic moments in history, please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. We have many more stories to tell. We'll see you next time.